Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
15 Memory Transcription Subject, Vickery, Venlo Volunteer Crewman of UNS Cardinal. Date, Standardized Human Time, October 30, 2136, 13 days after the Battle of Earth. I thanked every god from every religion I could think of for the existence of painkillers. I then thanked them some more for the existence of hot water and bathtubs. The thin strip under my tongue finished dissolving, and I sank further into the water. The pain in my ribs was dulled to near imperceptible levels. The medication caused a haze to move through my mind. It felt as though I'd just woken up from the best nap of my life. It also felt like I might return to said nap, which is probably why Dr. Inva insisted that I not bathe alone. Grant and Reese volunteered. It was now that I saw why. Would you stop it with the shampoo? It clearly isn't working, Grant grunted as he scrubbed at a stain on my chest to little avail. Reese tossed the near-empty bottle behind him. Well, what the hell are we gonna use? Turpentine? That might be what it's gonna take. Grant sat up and threw the sponge on the ground, slipping on the soap and water collecting on the tile around the tub. I groggily turned my head to them. Can't you guys just let me soak in peace? No, they said simultaneously. My ears stuck out sideways, and I sank back into the cloudy water, sending up bubbles as I sighed. Grant stood up. I'm going to look for a brush and some dish soap. Look for a pressure washer while you're at it. Grant scoffed as he walked out the door. I lifted my head up and shut my eyes. Finally, a break from their bickering. Tenga was right, those 17 miles were worth walking. Hamilton, Montana. Possibly the only place in this region with power and food. It had a small airport where surviving military personnel had set up base. They saw us coming and sent a vehicle to take us in. No one knew quite what to say when they pulled up next to us. Reese bear hugged one of the poor soldiers and nearly broke his spine. I chuckled to myself at the memory. There were dozens of humans and Venlo that had crashed down here. People from the town and a bunch of the surrounding settlements all chipped in to make this place a safe haven until rescue arrived. The hospital, high school, and airport were the only buildings with power. There were only so many generators to go around. The younger, healthier humans packed together in classrooms, while the sick and elderly stayed in the hospital, where we were waiting for news on Tenga and Querec. Until I was clean, however, the doctor had deemed me a walking health hazard. Grant returned with a brush in hand and a new bottle of soap. I groaned as he walked up next to me. Come on, stand up. You want to see Tenga and Querec, right? I stood out of the water and wobbled while Reese held me in place. Water drained off of my bloodied arms, stained a faint brown. Grant poured a bunch of soap over my head and shoulders and started combing through my fur with the brush. My matted and tangled coat grabbed at the brush with every stroke, threatening to pull me over into the water. I sighed. I don't know that you humans would understand this, but it does hurt when you pull at my fur. Grant scrubbed in some more soap. What are you gonna do about it, honey badger? He asked mockingly. I looked at him, dirty water draining off of my face. I maintained eye contact with him as I turned on the shower head above me. I continued staring at him as I let the warm water wash over my back. Grant raised an eyebrow at me as he paused. I lazily bared my teeth and made a vicious snarl before quickly jumping up and turning the shower head directly at him. Pandemonium promptly ensued as the predator backed away, slipping on the wet floor and falling on his tailbone, taking the entire shower curtain with him. Reese couldn't breathe. He doubled over, laughing hysterically. Grant wheezed, rolling around on the tile floor. I plopped back down in the water and tried to restrain myself from laughing too much. I didn't want to test the limits of these painkillers. The door suddenly burst open with a thud, and we all froze. Grant was soaking wet on the floor while Reese struggled to hold in his laughter. A human nurse walked in. She did not look pleased. I timidly reached over and turned the water off. I walked down the tile hallway wrapped in a white towel. It took a while, but I was relatively clean for the first time in weeks. I shivered as I followed the signs to where I saw Querek last. I rounded a corner and saw Querek sitting on a bed in front of Dr. Inva, a venal trauma surgeon with a pearly white coat. I stood outside the glass while she talked to the pilot. Querek seemed to look around the room thoughtfully the more she spoke. Moments later, the door in front of me slid open, and the doctor walked out, shutting the door behind her. "Well, you look a lot better than you did." "Only took them an hour and a half," she poked. "My fur still had faint bloodstains on it. It would take more than whatever they had in this hospital to get it out." "Thanks, I guess." "How is he?" I asked, wrapping the towel around me tighter. "Come with me. I'll wrap your arms back up and fill you in." I followed her down the hall. Querek noticed me through the window and waved with his healthy arm. I flicked my tail and nodded at him as we walked by. We entered a small exam room, and the doctor took one of my arms and began wrapping it from my wrist to my elbow. "The infection is waning, but without advanced imaging tech, we can't be sure what's wrong with his arm," she said, cutting the wrapping with a small pair of scissors. "The machines they have here are too power-hungry for our generators to cope with at the moment. There isn't much I can do about it now, but the nerves in his paw are useless." I hung my head. "So he won't fly again?" Inva sighed. "It's hard to say for sure. Depending on what caused it, surgery might restore some use of his paw, but from what I've seen, it's unlikely." My ears flattened as I looked away. Querek said he was okay with never flying again, but I wasn't so sure he meant that. Even if he did, his life would change forever without the use of his paw. I sat up on the table. "What about Tenga?" Inva finished wrapping up my other arm. She sighed as she sat down. "You'll need to talk to Dr. Ryland on that one. He should be in room 201. She propped her head up on one paw. I stared at her for a moment before hopping down and hurrying out the door. I rushed down the hall, blowing by nurses and other staff, and found room 201. Through the glass, I could see Tenga alone. Taking a deep breath, I slid the door open and quietly closed it behind me. I stood in front of his bed, still wrapped in a towel. The human was wearing a lavender-colored gown tied loosely around his gigantic frame. He smiled as I entered. "Wow. I'd almost forgotten what color you were." I chuckled as I walked over and sat down next to him. "Have they said anything?" The lieutenant's gaze became distant as his head angled downward. A few seconds passed, and he drew in his lip. "They say they can't be sure the shot will work." I feared as much. I saw this coming, but I couldn't help but feel desperate. I wanted to assure him that he'd be okay, that we'd find a way to cure him. As I opened my mouth to speak, the door slid open. An older human man walked in and noticed me sitting beside Tenga. He seemed slightly startled. He hobbled forward, assisted by a wooden cane, and stood at the foot of the bed. "You must be Vikri." "I'm sorry, I should have knocked before I walked in." "I'm Dr. Ryland." He bowed slightly. "Hello, doctor," I replied quietly. "Is he going to be okay?" Ryland looked over at Tenga through his glasses, squinting slightly. "Have you told him anything?" "I told him the dumbed-down version," Tenga muttered. Ryland looked down. "Well, as you know, I won't say a word more without your permission, but perhaps I could help your friend understand your condition. I think it's important that those who care about you know." He looked out of the top of his glasses at the lieutenant. Tenga sighed. He looked over at me before looking back at the doctor. "You could explain it a lot better than I could." "Go ahead," he said somewhat solemnly. "What are you two talking about?" I asked nervously. "Walk with me, and I'll fill you in." Ryland gestured for me to follow him to the door. I timidly got up and followed, shooting the lieutenant a worried look before I tailed him out the door. We began leisurely walking down the hallway before the old doctor sighed. "We've given him his first vaccine, but he's nearly 3 days late. The wounds were also severe and closer to his brain than I'd like. The virus has a huge head start on us. The vaccine may be too little too late. I stopped in the hallway and turned to him. Tears welled up in my eyes. My heart felt like it might explode. Is he going to die? I choked. Ryland grunted as he knelt beside me, propping himself up on the cane. The possibility is very real. Rabies is such an unpredictable thing. It is unlike any other illness on this planet. The virus could be in his brain within the next couple of days, but it's just as likely to take weeks. He sighed. But I promise you that we'll do everything we can. I've spoken to Dr. Inva. She thinks that, with enough time, Venlil researchers might be able to come up with something. But that's the big factor now. Time. I wiped my eyes and nodded. How is he taking that? Ryland chuckled softly. He wouldn't want you to worry. I can see he cares a lot about you. About all of you. He's not the kind of man to let the possibility of death interfere with his mission, getting all of you home. He smiled. Just be there for him. No matter the outcome. He appreciates it even if he doesn't show it. I collected myself with a deep breath. Thank you, Doctor. Ryland gently patted me on the shoulder and shakily stood up with some assistance from his cane. I paced in the hallway for a minute before walking back toward Tenga's room. I opened the door to find everyone else already there as well as someone I hadn't yet seen. She was a human with shorter, black hair tied back in a bun. She was dressed in the distinctive human military camouflage. She and the rest were in the middle of a conversation. Any communication we've sent out either hasn't been received, or there's no one out there to receive it. With the number of people here, we'll start running short on food as early as next week. Medicine is already dwindling, she said, pacing slowly across the room. Tenga noticed me. Vic, this is Commander Foster. She's been organizing the military survivors around here. Commander, that's Vic. The Venlil who threw a rock at a bear, she chuckled. It's nice to finally meet you. I walked over and shook her hand, seeing the stress and exhaustion on her face. Her eyes were baggy and bloodshot. Tenga sat up and rubbed his hands together. So no communications get out. Or no one's getting them. Foster turned back to the group standing beside the bed. Well, that option leaves us with nothing to do but starve to death. I'd rather explore the other one. Tenga looked up at the commander before looking at me and squinting. Vic, if we get you some tools, can you charge up that datapad? I walked closer. I think so. Why? How was he so calm? I could hardly put his condition out of my mind enough to speak, but he seemed to not even know he was sick. Sigra said she was following a transponder. We've assumed it was a transponder from a wrecked ship, but what if we're wrong? Commander Foster lowered her hand from her chin. You think there's an intact Federation ship out there? That's impossible. We've been patrolling the valley for days. We'd have seen one if it was close by. Grant stepped in. It fits. A ship crash lands and can't move, so the only thing they can do is try and hide by activating jammers. Your patrols might not have gone out far enough to see it. It could be anywhere. Everyone thought in silence. Grant was right, it fit, but the odds of a ship being in good enough shape to jam our comms after a crash landing seemed outlandish. How do you even hide an entire ship for weeks? There was no way a larger vessel could manage that, so a small destroyer was the best suspect. Tenga stood up. Vic, get that data pad up and running and see what you can find. I'm going to talk to Sigra. He marched out of the room. Foster and I followed behind. I hurried down the road through Hamilton, heading for the airport. The sky was oddly cloudy today. The town was shrouded in a dreary gray shadow as snow fluttered to the ground. It was cold. Colder than I remembered. The streets were empty. Lifeless buildings on either side of the road were boarded up and slowly degrading. As I made my way down the hill toward an intersection, my paws lost traction entirely as I ran straight into a patch of near-invisible ice. My worn-down claws were useless. I yelped before I slipped and fell on my back, sliding the rest of the way down the hill. I groaned as I lay there in the middle of the lifeless intersection. I had officially found the limit of the painkillers. I placed a paw over my head and shut my eyes, waiting for the pain to subside. My ears perked up as I heard something from my left. I opened my eyes and rolled my head over to see Lucky approaching. Tenga ensured everyone knew she was harmless so she wouldn't be shot or driven off. She'd been running around town for the past few hours, scavenging food. She walked up to me, looking down at me with those piercing, amber eyes. Her ears perked up as she twisted her head at me. Fear started swelling up in my stomach. It would be so easy for her to tear my throat out. I winced as she sniffed at my face before licking me repeatedly. Is she tasting me? I flailed my paws as I shot up. Lucky backed away and laid down, resting her head in the snow as she stared at me. I panted as I stood up, wiping the saliva from my face. A human was walking down the street toward me. It seemed to be an older man. He was tall and lanky, dressed in thick coveralls and a furry cap with flaps hanging over the ears. Whoever it was, I doubted they were out here for a stroll. It was freezing. That your dog? I caught her rummaging around in my barn. I heard the man say. His tone was light and playful. He chuckled to himself as he looked down at Lucky. She isn't mine, but we're acquainted. I looked down at her. Her tongue hung from her mouth as she panted, still staring at me. I'm sorry, but I've got something important to do. I took off again down the street. All right, I guess I'll keep an eye on her. The man trailed off as I got further away. I arrived at the main airport building and burst through the doors. A human in military garb approached me. Whoa there, little guy, what's the big hurry? I need a plasma cutter or a good saw, a soldering kit, a bunch of spare batteries, and 30 minutes alone. The human squinted as he looked down at me. I slung the pack off my shoulders. Some water would also be nice, I panted. Commander Foster walked through the door. Do what he says. Yes, ma'am, the human stuttered as he hurried down the hall. Foster put a hand on my shoulder and walked with me down the hall. Sigra claims she doesn't know anything other than it's to the north. Can you figure out any more than that with that thing? I looked up at her as we walked. If I can get it up and running, I can analyze the signal from the transponder. They transmit codes with it that can give you an idea of the ship's status. Help search and rescue teams decide which ships need the most help. Sigra wouldn't know that, the commander asked, opening a door in the hallway. I don't know. She might not have seen it. She only came into possession of this after a bear killed the last crocodile that had it. By then, it had no power. I pulled the red device from the bag and set it down on a table in the room. A couple of humans brought some equipment in. Okay then, I'll leave you to it. Minutes passed in the dark, cramped room as I carefully finished cutting off the faceplate. I used a small rotary saw to try and avoid cutting too deep. It was slow, but I couldn't risk damaging any internal parts with a torch. Concentrating was difficult. I couldn't get my mind off Tenga. I didn't know what I'd do if I lost him like that. It couldn't be a peaceful way to go. He deserved better. All of these people deserved better. I'm going to make it better. The front plate popped off with a sharp clang, and the saw revved down. I took off the goggles over my eyes. I slowly lifted it up and set it to the side. A bundle of wires ran from a circuit board mounted to the back into the detached display. Below the board was the battery. Bingo! I carefully got to work on removing it. Next to me was a small plastic box of a bunch of batteries the humans had scrounged up. Everything ranging from disposable units to large, rechargeable polymer cells. One of these had to work. We were getting out of here. Tenga was getting to Venlil Prime. I looked up from my work, and the head of the screwdriver in my paw clanged against the table. Did that guy call Lucky a dog?